In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, logging companies expanded deep into America's forests in pursuit of old-growth timber that could no longer be accessed by rivers or roads. These camps were off the grid and did not appear on any public map. The logging companies expanded into the woods by building railroads, often temporary, privately owned lines into the most remote wilderness areas. These rails became the only lifeline for workers in logging camps. No highways, no bus routes, no towns within walking distance. In these places, the forest decided who stayed and who left, and leaving the woods was not as simple as clocking out or just deciding to quit. This is the dark side of railroad logging, the story of workers who were trapped inside the camps. Railroad logging was not a theoretical construct. It was a lived reality across regions like Oregon, Idaho, Washington, and beyond. In Oregon, companies like the Coos Bay Lumber Company operated railroad logging camps such as Camp 2, situated well beyond any public road. There, bunk cars, mess cars, and support facilities were carried by train to wherever the cut front moved next. In Idaho, archives contain images of railroad logging camps built along spur lines, radiating from small towns into dense forests where trains carrying stacks of logs passed right through worker quarters. And in Washington, companies like the Schaefer brothers ran one of the largest interconnected networks of logging railroads, with scores of miles of track and dozens of camps housing thousands of workers. These were real places. They were isolated by design. The rails moved deeper into the forest as timber was harvested, and camps followed the cut line. Roads into deep forests were rare and costly to build. Rivers had once been the backbone of early logging, but by the 1880s, most accessible river transport routes were already claimed. To reach virgin timber in rugged hills and mountains, companies turned to railroads. These lines were the only way to move heavy logs, supplies, workers, and machinery into and out of logging regions. But because these railroads were private, temporary, and built only for extraction purposes, they lacked regular schedules and were under the sole control of the company. Without a public road, workers could not simply walk out, get a ride, or catch a train run by a county or state railroad. Movement in and out of these camps was controlled by one entity, the company that owned the rails. Many railroad logging camps were not just isolated, they were controlled by ecosystems. Workers in remote camps like Camp 2 were housed in company-provided bunk cars, mobile dormitories on wheels. These rail cars included sleeping quarters, mess halls, commissaries, and even basic workshop facilities. Because these camps moved with the logging fronts, there was no permanent town to walk back to. In many logging operations across the Pacific Northwest and northern Idaho, workers relied on rail lines not just for their job, but for everyday life. That meant housing carried by rail, food and supplies brought in by rail, medical transport dependent on rail. The company didn't need fences or guards. The isolation itself, maintained by the rails, was enough to make leaving difficult. Unlike public rail services, railroad logging trains did not operate on regular schedules. They ran only when the company had a reason, moving timber, relocating camp cars, or hauling supplies. If a worker attempted to quit and leave a camp, there was often no scheduled departure. The train might not run that day. It might run only long enough to reposition logs. It might be weeks before an outbound trip was scheduled. In documented accounts and oral histories from workers' descendants, men and families sometimes found themselves waiting for days at remote camps after quitting, simply because no train was available to take them out. This wasn't legal coercion, at least not on paper, but it resulted in the same consequence. Movement was possible only at the company's convenience. Logging was among the most hazardous jobs in America, with injuries common from falling trees, rails, and equipment. In remote railroad camps, medical care was minimal. At best, a camp might have a company nurse or basic first aid kit. Serious injuries required evacuation, but evacuation meant getting a train, and that wasn't guaranteed. Contemporary accounts describe injured workers being placed on flat cars or freight cars and transported slowly back to towns because specialized medical transport was unavailable. Others waited for days for the next rail movement. In these conditions, an injury could delay a worker's departure from a camp by weeks, long after he had stopped working. A significant portion of the workforce in railroad logging was made up of immigrants, men who came from Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and other regions seeking work. Many had little command of English and were unfamiliar with American land law, terrain, or worker rights. Recruiters often emphasized steady pay without disclosing the reality of living deep in the woods with limited access to towns or outside communication. This created another layer of isolation, not just geographic, but cultural. Workers unfamiliar with the land were at even greater risk if they tried to leave on foot, especially without clear paths or landmarks leading back to civilization. Documented labor and forestry reports from the early 20th century make one thing clear: logging camps were not near roads, and walking out often meant traversing dense, unmapped forest, swampy terrain, rugged mountains, and rivers with no bridges. These areas were dangerous, even for experienced woodsmen. For someone abandoning a job and trying to find a township miles away, the risk was real. Exposure, injury, starvation, getting lost. Locomotive rails didn't just bring workers in, they defined where they could feasibly go. One documented example comes from the Schaefer Brothers Logging Company in the Pacific Northwest, which operated an extensive rail network that served dozens of logging camps and supported thousands of workers. At its peak, The company's operations covered more than 100 miles of track, 18 locomotives, and dozens of campsites nestled deep in forested terrain. These rails moved workers and timber alike, and as the cut front progressed, so did the camp locations. For workers, this meant that their residence and only connection out moved deeper into the woods with every extension of the rail line. As timber was harvested and rails were extended, temporary camps could not simply be left behind. Without access to a road, the workers' only link to the outside world remained the steel tracks behind them. Another example comes from the Camp 2 of the Coos Bay Lumber Company, a railroad logging operation in southern Oregon. Camp 2 was typical of early 20th century logging camps. Bunk cars and mess cars, crew housed along the rail line, supplies delivered by train. Workers shuttled into woods daily by small motor cars known as crummies. Because these camps were portable and entirely tied to rail infrastructure, their mobility came at the cost of permanence. Workers who left the front found themselves at the mercy of the rail schedule for any hope of reaching town. The isolation inherent in such camps was structural, not accidental. By the mid-20th century, several technological and social changes began to break this cycle. A growing network of improved roads, the rise of logging trucks that could reach remote areas, labor reforms and workers' compensation laws, greater public scrutiny of working conditions. These changes meant workers eventually had alternatives to rail-only access. Roads allowed independent travel. Trucks reduced dependence on railroad timetables. But for decades before these developments, workers in railroad logging camps lived with one constant fact: their mobility was linked to the rails, and the rails were controlled by the boss man.